This is Democracy Watch. I'm joined by my co-host, voting rights attorney, and founder of Democracy Docket, Marc Elias. Marc, we've done 10 episodes of Democracy Watch so far. This is the episode I've been waiting for. Can you give an update on the monumental news out of New York today?
We won. The voters of New York won. Democrats won. The Court of Appeals, the intermediate court there, held that the Independent State Redistricting Commission needs to draw a new congressional map for 2024.
Okay, so why did the court rule this way? Like, what was their rationale?
Yeah, so the court got it entirely right. The court found that the Independent Redistricting Commission, which was created by the people of New York in 2014 to do the state's redistricting, that the first map they had proposed, that was the source of the first round of litigation that everyone read about that led to a court-drawn map, that court-drawn map only stays in place for 2022, but that the Independent Redistricting Commission needs to take a second shot at drawing a constitutional map, that they need to do that now. They need to do it, in the words of the court, forthwith, which for those of you who don't have a legal dictionary means right now, this moment.
Can you just give a quick update on the partisan bend of that map?
Yeah, so the map that was drawn was by the court in New York was an extreme Republican gerrymander. I'm not saying that the judge intended it to be such, but although he was a Republican judge in a very Republican part of New York. Yes, there are very Republican parts of New York. Steuben County, New York, if you're ever there, you're in one of those very Republican parts of New York. The special master he drew, frankly, just trampled all over traditional redistricting criteria for people who live in New York at divided communities of interest. It made a hash of the New York City area. And so that map led to a partisan skew in favor of Republicans. I'm very confident that a neutrally drawn map by this bipartisan Independent Redistricting Commission will restore New York to look like what you would expect out of New York, which, will probably add someplace between 4 and 6 Democratic seats.
Okay, now, obviously, as we look forward here, can this decision be appealed, or will this order from the court be binding and these maps will be redrawn?
Brian, we live in America. You can always appeal, right? So I don't want people to overread the fact that they hear that it can be appealed. Yes, almost every case can be appealed somewhere, right? Unless it's the U.S. Supreme Court, it can always be appealed. So yes, this case can be appealed to the highest court in New York, which is called the New York State Court of Appeals. But I have no reason to believe that court wants to trample on the state constitutional provision empowering a nonpartisan or bipartisan Independent Redistricting Commission.
Right.
So I think, Republicans are welcome to spend their time and energy to seek review. But I think that the bottom line is for 2024, we're going to have a new fair map in place. And that's going to be a good thing for Democrats and a good thing for the voters in New York.
To the point that you were just making, Governor Hochul appointed a new associate judge to the highest court. That court went from having, basically a conservative majority. How does that new appointment impact the court's makeup? And I guess, how do you anticipate that court, with that new makeup, would rule on a case like this?
Yeah, so the prior case that I mentioned that went up to the high court in New York that struck down the first sort of effort that led to this interim map for 2022, that was a 4-3 decision. So 4 justices on the state Supreme Court said that the map, that the lower court was right in striking it down and imposing a new map. 3 justices said, no, actually that trial judge got it wrong and there should not have been a new map even for 2022. As you point out, since that time, one of the 4 justices has been replaced by a justice appointed by the governor. How that justice will rule, I don't know. Whether, frankly, the 3 justices that remain on the court from the majority that really were dealing with the exigent circumstances of 2022, whether they'll hold, I don't know. But I'm confident that at the end of the day, there'll be at least 4 state Court of Appeals justices that will say that the Independent Redistricting Commission that were voted on and put in the Constitution by the people of New York, that it should have the authority to do its job.
I want to dig into this a little bit further because you mentioned this before. The number of seats that could be up for grabs for Democrats as a result of this ruling. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that most experts, and I'm a lawyer, I'm not a prognosticator on seats, though I'm from New York. I lived on Long Island. I lived just north and west of New York City. I went to college in upstate New York, so I have some familiarity with the geography. And I think most prognosticators think that a fair map would probably change the current delegation by about 4 to 6 seats. The fact is, George Santos right now sits in a seat that, if fairly drawn, would be a Democratic seat on Long Island. The district that Mondaire Jones used to represent, that then wound up being a primary that Congressman Lawler now sits in, that's a Democratic seat. That's a seat I grew up in. There's a district that former Democratic Representative Anthony Brindisi lost by 6 votes a couple of cycles ago. That's now was contorted into a solidly Republican district. That area has become more Democratic. So you can see the places where, frankly, just if you follow the communities of interest, you'll wind up with Democrats gaining seats.
Now, this new map in New York could offset gains that Republicans are expected to make in a state like North Carolina, for example, where a new conservative court has allowed a neutral map to instead be replaced by a Republican map. Could you explain just briefly what happened in North Carolina?
Yeah, I think it's really important, first of all, that people not equate the two, and I'm not saying you did, but what happened in North Carolina is the state legislature enacted a partisan gerrymander. We know it's a partisan gerrymander because they said it's a partisan gerrymander. It went up through the courts. The courts said, hey, you're not allowed to partisan gerrymander. And the Republicans' main claim is, oh, yes, but we are. We're allowed to partisan gerrymander. They lost that initially. Ultimately, there was a change in composition of the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court, in a very highly controversial and unusual circumstance, decided to reconsider their prior ruling and said, oh, never mind, partisan gerrymandering is just fine. And so we're going to see the Republican legislature in North Carolina enact a new map that will be, in their view, and probably proudly announced as a partisan gerrymander. The thing about North Carolina, and my warning to Republicans is, Allen v. Milligan stands for the proposition you can't discriminate, you can't gerrymander Black voters out of power. And as you look at the map in North Carolina, I think some of their planned gerrymanders may run afoul of the Voting Rights Act.
By the way, doesn't North Carolina already have an extreme gerrymander? I mean, how many more seats would they be able to squeeze out of that?
Right. So this is the thing, right? This is part of the cancer that the Supreme Court, put into the bloodstream in an earlier Supreme Court case where they said there's no federal ban on partisan gerrymandering. And now we're seeing in states like North Carolina, which is, if you just say you can be as extreme as you want to be, like, the sky's the limit, Brian. There's really, if you don't care about traditional redistricting criteria and you're willing to trample across communities of interest and not worry about geographic, compactness, you can really do a number on a state. And North Carolina, I fear, is in for it.
Now, can you explain, to that exact point, can you explain the progress on new maps that we can expect to see as a result of those new opportunity districts in states like Louisiana and Alabama because of that case Milligan?
Yeah, so the Allen v. Milligan case, which upheld Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and really caught the Republicans leaning the wrong way. Brian, it's like the baseball player who's like taking too much of a lead off of first base and they're sort of leaning towards second base, thinking they're going to steal, and then they get picked off. The Republican legislatures in a lot of these southern states, they thought the Supreme Court was going to strike down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So what they did is they enacted maps that sort of cheated forward as if that was going to happen, and then they got caught because Allen v. Milligan didn't do that. So I think you're going to see, obviously in Alabama, you're going to see a second majority Black district. I think you're going to for sure see that in Louisiana. I'm pretty confident you're going to see it in Georgia. You may very well see a number of additional Voting Rights Act district minority districts in Texas. And then under state constitution, Florida Supreme Court's gotten very conservative, but they have a state constitutional provision that prohibits the retrogression to discriminate against Black voters. It's hard to see how even this conservative court upholds what happened to Al Lawson's district in Florida.
Well, now, are there any other cases working through the courts right now with major implications for the House in 2024?
Yeah, there are cases all over the place. I mean, there's a case in Utah about whether or not their map was unlawfully gerrymandered. You can see what it did in terms of dividing up Salt Lake City. There's a case, I believe, in Kentucky that also is still weaving its way through the court. So, look, I don't think people ought to give up on fair maps. I don't think people ought to give up on the idea that people choose their elected representatives rather than the other way around. But today, on a day that, the people of New York could have been deprived fair maps, the courts came through, democracy was on the docket, and it won, and we should celebrate that.
Well, that seems like a perfect place to leave off. So especially thank you to you and your team for representing the interests in this case. And we'll keep an eye on it as soon as it goes onto its last leg of the appeals process. But for anybody watching, if you want to help Marc, then make sure to sign up for Democracy Docket. It is a free news outlet focused on voting and elections. The link is right here on the screen, and it's also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.